A percentage of South Africans, a large percentage of South Africans believe the president of the country is corrupt. That's 38%. A whopping 70% believe government is doing a bad job of fighting corruption. These are just some of the shocking findings of Transparency International's Global Corruption Barometer. The Barometer reports on the results of a survey conducted among 47,000 citizens in 35 countries. Important to point out, in a moment, I'll be joined by Melusi Ncala, who is researcher at Corruption Watch. But before we get there, let me show you a sampling of some of the results in as far as they relate to 3 countries that I want to show you. You have South Africa. This is the picture in as far as that Global Corruption Barometer is concerned. The question was asked of the respondents, is the government doing a good or a bad job of fighting corruption? 25% in 2019 believe that South Africa, the government is doing a good job. 25% only. 70% believe South Africa, that government is doing a bad job of fighting corruption. Let me show you the other slide then, in as far as South Africa is concerned. Corruption by institution, there's that figure I was referring to. 38% in 2019 believing that the president/prime minister in our country, of course, we have a president. 38% believing that the president is corrupt. That compares to 46% in 2015. Remember, this is a survey that was done between September 2016 and September 2018. So in part, it falls within the time of former President Jacob Zuma and also during the time of the current President Cyril Ramaphosa. So that's the perception in as far as corruption is concerned. Bribery, the rates are said to be at about 18%, and they relate to all sorts of services that you see listed there. Let's compare that then with another country that features in the 35 countries where this survey was done. The Democratic Republic of the Congo. You have 13% of people there believing that government is doing a good job of fighting corruption. Just 13%, and 80% saying that government is doing a bad job, and 7% don't know. Let's compare that then with how people perceive in the Democratic Republic of Congo corruption by institution. 82% of people in the Democratic Republic of the Congo believe that their president or prime minister is corrupt, and you see 79% perceiving members of parliament to be corrupt. In our case, it's about 44% for members of parliament. Government officials, 66%. Lastly, let's show you this picture then, and bribery rates in the DRC at about 80%, according to the people that were sampled and interviewed in that country. Lastly, here's a good picture though. It comes out of Tanzania. In Tanzania, the question being asked, is the government doing a good job of fighting corruption? 71% people saying that they believe government is doing a good job, compared to 37% in 2015. And 23% saying that they believe government is doing a bad job of fighting corruption. And let's show you then also perceptions of corruption by institution. The president there is John Magufuli, of course. John Magufuli came amid those promises of fighting corruption and instituted quite a number of changes. Look at that, it's reflecting. 2015, 15% people believing that the prime minister is corrupt. Even by those numbers, Tanzania was really doing well, and now it's down to just 4% believing that the president is corrupt, and about 8% believing that members of parliament are corrupt. The figure for police is really high also in the DRC, in Tanzania rather, 36% believing that police are corrupt. So let me show you the last 2 slides then. Bribery rates as perceived by people in Tanzania, 18%, and I think it's consistent with our situation. And that's the last thing that I wanted to show you in as far as bribery rates are concerned. So that's how it's looking. 35 countries, 47,000 respondents interviewed by Transparency International. So I'm joined by Melusi Ncala from Corruption Watch, whose Corruption Watch is, of course, a chapter and affiliated to Transparency International. Thank you so much for coming through, Melusi. So this corruption perception this corruption perception index and barometer that has been released, are you surprised by what it found in as far as South Africa is concerned? I mean, the figure is 38% people believing that the president of the country is corrupt.
I don't think it's that much of a surprise. I think it ties in with the current mood of the country in that, people are feeling a bit distrustful. People are thinking that corruption is a big problem, and it's reflected in these results. Similarly, as we have seen, especially when you have to think about what is said about the police in this particular study versus a study that we as Corruption Watch released last month about the police.
Yeah, and the police, of course, being one of the institutions. I wonder where that comes from, Melusi. Does it come from some of the inaction that we have seen in light of some of the corruption that has been ongoing over the last few years in the country? There's certainly the perception that police agencies such as police, the National Prosecuting Authority and others have sat on their hands in the wake of things such as state capture.
Yeah, I mean, with regards to this one, definitely we can say it's about how these institutions are being perceived. People are likely to think that, there's nothing happening. And in fact, in some instances, the officials are colluding with criminals, and in some instances, people even feel that they themselves have to be corrupt if they want some kind of action. So it's a multitude of factors that contribute to this particular grim picture.
And this issue that you raised, that sometimes people believing that they themselves have to engage in corruption to see some kind of action, talks to the issue of bribery. In as far as the perceptions of bribery in this country, we're talking at about 18% being the rate that is estimated. But interestingly, it's the poor who, according to this study, find themselves paying bribes for services, things that they should be entitled to.
Yeah, it's one of those sad findings about the study that poor people are twice as likely to have to pay a bribe more than rich people. It also says something about men are more than half of the percentage suggests that men are also likely to pay bribes. But just tying it with your point about for services, it's people having to pay bribes for receiving water, electricity, people having to receive healthcare, people having to receive services from the police. Even as far as schools, yes, it's a low percentage, some might say, but it's still basic things that people like yourself, I would need, that people feel you need to pay something towards that if you want access to them.
In fact, if we break down in terms of the bribery rates in our country, you see that police, having to bribe police, that accounts for about 19% of the bribery rate, and utilities that you just mentioned, about 10%. But I'm wondering about the perception that the government is doing a bad job at fighting corruption. This is the whole mantra of what President Cyril Ramaphosa and his administration have promised us, that the fight against corruption will be stepped up. Part of the survey, of course, started during the tenure of former President Jacob Zuma, but it actually completed during the tenure of the current president. Yet, South Africans remain unconvinced. Slight improvement. 2015, 79% of people thought government was doing a bad job of fighting corruption. We're at 70%, but we're still far from people regaining that confidence. Are you surprised by this?
It's a process having to deal with corruption. I think that's the first thing that we all need to concede to. And secondly, we always have to continuously have to highlight that it remains a problem. And in so doing, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't, because people will then continue to perceive corruption to be an issue. So for us, only time will tell in as far as the government's commitment is to deal with corruption. And perhaps in future studies, then we will see that number decreasing. But at present, it is an overwhelming number.
Yeah, and the private sector, Melusi, also features in as far as the story around institutions that are the perception of corruption by institution. Private sector business executives, and that figure remains stubbornly high. I mean, in 2015, it was 38% of the people surveyed that perceived business executives as being corrupt, and there's a slight drop of just 1% in 2019. 37% still being perceived as 37% still perceiving business executives as being corrupt. But how do we tackle that? What would make a change for people to perceive the private sector as being less corrupt? Should we start seeing people being taken to prison for some of the big scandals that we've seen in corporate South Africa?
Definitely. People want to see outcomes. People want to see people, personalities being held accountable. You know, if you're accused of something, then they want to see the wheels of justice turning and not turning at a slow pace, or perhaps you being favored by the system. But also there are bigger issues that need to be attended to, where the international community, or multinational companies specifically, need to adhere to the highest standards when it comes to bribery acts or conforming to those. So it's, again, a number of things that government and private sector needs to do hand in hand in addressing these kind of issues, because that number, when you think about it in conjunction with the 70%, actually just illustrates that there's an intersection between public sector and private sector corruption.
Lastly, Melusi, the Global Corruption Barometer finding that in the case of South Africa, 57% of the people surveyed believe that ordinary people can make a difference in the fight against corruption. That's encouraging. We should take heart in that. It's not high enough, 57%, but does it tally with your experience that people believe that they have the power to make change in as far as the fight against corruption is concerned?
You know, we are a resilient people. We've always had hope in our ability to put our minds together to have some form of action when we believe there's a problem in society, when there's an injustice. Our history proves that, and one can only hope that this 57% speaks to that point exactly. Yes, when you look at the whole study as a whole, 2/3 of the people are still scared to report incidents of corruption, and that also tells you that, you know, something needs to be done about that. So to able to take that figure of 57% higher, you know, we need to ensure that there are measures in place to protect whistleblowers, and these measures are enforced by all costs. So people need to take heart of what's happening in their society, in their communities, and report actions of corruption.
All right, thank you so much for coming through, Melusi Ncala from Corruption Watch, joining us and reacting to this Global Corruption Barometer. It's a fascinating read about perceptions of corruption by citizens in 35